Thank you, Lord, again for this day and for the reminder that you are in the storm, in the midst of the storm with us, that you are here, and that you are fully aware of us and our needs. God, I pray you'd strengthen us today for the tasks that we have. And I pray that specifically for each of these students, that you'd strengthen them, help them as they give to you each of the challenges that are theirs. Help them, God, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. So let's see if I can do a screen share here. Well, today we are going to be talking about the rise of Protestant missions. But before I do that, I want to remind you that there's no class next week, neither Tuesday nor Thursday. So use that time however you wish. If you have a paper, still do. And I'm looking at one. Please get that into me. Also, if you are intending to do an oral presentation, remember I gave you a week ago some options for the final. You need to let me know you're going to do that oral presentation and what it is so I can schedule you. You have 3 days, the 3rd and the 10th of December to do those presentations. And I need to know so I can schedule you. Okay, thank you. And looking forward to hearing that. So one of the great impacts of the Second Great Awakening, both in England and America, was, as we said last week, was a spontaneous kind of movement toward world mission. And there's a ton we could have talked about the abolitionist movement, could have gone into that, the impact of the Civil War on the church. D.L. Moody was a very important figure, the second half of the 20th century, the 19th century, as was Francis Xavier in the Catholic Church. He was a lot earlier on, though. I believe he was in the 16th century, working in evangelism in India, China, and Japan. We could have talked about the Catholic movement to working with the indigenous people of Latin America, particularly the work of the Jesuits. There's just too much material to talk about. So I have decided to concentrate on Protestant missions and the rise of them in Great Britain and America because they had such a profound impact on the world Christianity, and to this day have had an incredible contact, so that the number of Christians in the world today who call themselves Protestant vastly outnumbers the number of Protestant Christians in America and Western Europe. The number of worldwide Christians, including South America, Africa, and in Asia. I won't include the Protestant Christians in Antarctica, which, we'll just call them the frozen chosen, whatever ones there are there. So anyway, this is an important area. And I also want you to become aware of the kind of challenges that these Christians faced, these missionaries. Sometimes I look at these things and I say, how could they ever do such things? But there you go. We'll talk about that a little bit today. So let's do a little bit of a review first. I want you to see what's going on in Europe at this time, or since the time of the Reformation. In the 17th century, Great Britain, Puritans were hanging on, and Great Britain was, because of its book, Fox's Book of Martyrs, that was put next to every Bible in the church. There was a very strong Protestant church among common people and the educated. But monarchs in India, notably Charles I, Charles II, and James II, were trying to lead Great Britain back to Catholicism. Great Britain really wasn't out of the woods until the end of the 17th century, when they invited the Prince of Orange from the Netherlands to come over to be the King of England. But there was a struggle there. And so there really wasn't an orientation toward world mission. And moreover, a lot of the Puritans and a lot of the serious-minded Christians were moving to America, where they had a frontier to conquer. In the Netherlands, there was a long war of independence from Spain, or the Holy Roman Empire. A long war, which the Netherlands eventually fought to a standstill, and Spain gave up. Although the Low Countries included Belgium at the time, which had a lot of Protestants in it, and that was taken over by Spain and Holy Roman Empire and became Catholic. In Germany, the Lutheran state church kind of took hold, and it became pretty traditional and theological. It didn't have a lot of emotion in it. Remember, in America, Puritans wanted to make sure, and in England, that people had had a personal experience of Jesus Christ. In the Lutheran state church in Germany, this was not the case. It just became a kind of a state church. Although the Pietists, and notably led by people like Spener, Zinzendorf, and the Moravians, did insist on this personal and heartwarming experience, and even affected John Wesley, who he was very impressed by Moravians. That's a group of people in what we call the Czech Republic today that spread out into Poland and into Germany. In France, bloody repression had caused the departure of 500,000 Protestants from France. And that came at about 1685 with the revocation of the Edict of Toleration, the Edict of Nantes, Nantes. So France had pockets of strong Protestants, and they continue to this day, about 2% of the French population, maybe 4%. But it returned to the Catholic fold, more or less. And of course, in Italy and Spain, Protestantism was repressed. Central Europe, there was a terrible 30 Years' War. A lot of people call it religious war. It started out as such, but really it was the birth of nations. Because sometimes Catholic nations would ally, like France, with Protestant ones to fight Catholics. So it wasn't entirely about religion. A lot of it was the birth of the modern state and nationhood. Nevertheless, these wars in Central Europe, repression of Protestants, the attempt just to hang on for Protestants in Europe, meant that missions was not an important emphasis. Whereas for Catholics, they were going forward with this, with missions. And I mentioned Francis Xavier. I am having trouble with my screen here. So that's just a kind of a review of what's going on in Europe. But now the Second Awakening took hold. First, the First Great Awakening in America, that also touched Great Britain. And then the Second Great Awakening, God poured out his Spirit in unusual ways. God had a purpose for this, and that was to use, in my opinion, as a church historian, he was using this to prepare us and the world to spread the gospel elsewhere in the world. So because he blessed Wesley, Whitfield, Edwards, Finney, he also caused young men to respond to the gospel, young men and women, and began to encourage the birth of this missionary movement. The first inklings of this in America were from college. Andover Theological Seminary was one, and Williams College. Out of that came something called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. And 5 men in particular banded together to form this band: Samuel Newell, Luther Rice, Samuel Knott Jr., Gordon Hall, and one Adoniram Judson, who is a famous name actually in missions. Adoniram Judson, I believe he began as a Presbyterian, but on his way over to Burma, was talking to someone and became convinced that being a Baptist was better and that adult baptism was the way to go. So he converted to the Baptist kind of faith, and he began to evangelize Burma, what we now know as Myanmar. These 5 men were inspired by what they read from the work of one William Carey of England, who had been working in England since 1793. And we're going to spend some time looking at him. But they were reading this, and suddenly these 5, because they'd formed this mission group and began to go on missions themselves, provided the inspiration for a whole flood of young Americans who began to travel overseas and to evangelize. Incidentally, Adoniram Judson had a lifelong struggle. This man went over and learned the language. He became a kind of diplomat for the British, tried to help end the war there against the British, was thrown in prison. His wife died while he was in prison, and he spent months totally depressed by the loss of her, and would just sit by her grave and worry that he had helped the British and he was off trying to do this negotiating when his wife had called and said, "I need you." In his whole life, only one person converted to the Christian faith. But that one person was a Karen tribesman. And as a result of that one Karen tribesman's testimony, the whole tribe of Karen became Christian and is to this day. Actually, they are fighting a war against the central government for their own independence, because they have long been repressed by the Buddhist government. America gave hundreds of missionaries to the cause of evangelism, but to truly gain an appreciation for the Protestant missionary movement, I think it'd be good for us to look at 3 particular individuals and their life story and how they impacted 19th century missions around the world. These 3 were William Carey, Hudson Taylor, and David Livingstone. William Carey was a shoemaker. And there you see a picture of him. He is oftentimes called the father of modern missions. He was born in 1761 into a family of weavers in Northamptonshire, northwest of London, on the road to Birmingham. Very early, he began a love affair with learning and languages, and soon taught himself Latin in order to better understand the natural sciences and botany. Of course, everything was in Latin for those sciences. When he was 14, his father apprenticed him to a shoemaker, and that shoemaker taught him New Testament Greek. He married another shoemaker's daughter, Dorothy Plackett, in 1781. Dorothy was illiterate, had never gone outside her own home or her own village. Carrie and she were impoverished, but he kept on. And he called himself a plodder. He said, I can plod, I can persevere to any definite pursuit. I'm a plodder. I'm just a plodder. And plod and persevere he did. He took over his boss's business when he died, and during the time he was making shoes, Carey taught himself Hebrew, Italian, Dutch, and French. In 1785, he began to pastor a local Baptist church and read a book by the American Jonathan Edwards. Remember Jonathan Edwards of Northampton's Little Awakening fame. He started reading his book probably about the revival in Northampton. Oh, no, it was another book, actually. It was a book about David Brainerd. David Brainerd is someone we haven't talked about, but he was an American missionary to the Indians between 1718 and 1747. This guy would just spend hours in prayer and trying to evangelize these Indians. He wasn't even 30 years old when he died, and wrote a book. And actually, it was Edwards who wrote a book about him. And Carey began to argue that Jesus' Great Commission applied to all Christians of all times. And he scolded his fellow believers for ignoring it. He said, multitudes sit at ease and give themselves no concern about the far greater part of their fellow sinners, who to this day are lost in ignorance and idolatry. So at a ministers' meeting in 1786, Carey raised the question of the duty of all Christians to spread the gospel throughout the world. He wasn't even 30 years old. And an elderly man who was a friend of Carey's father, a friend of John Ryland, actually, stood up and he said, young man, sit down. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine. What do you think about that statement? What are your thoughts? Yeah, Matt.
Technically right, but wrong thing he's taking out of it. Technically it's right, because we can't convert anybody. We can't save anybody. Only God can do it, and he does it complete without our aid. But God has told us to preach the gospel to every creature, to spread the good news. Therefore, at the same time, this is wrong and right. Not that, so it's wrong about the young man sit down. If he wants to go and feels the Lord is calling him to go teach, that is what he should do. And the second part is right, because God will do it without our aid. He will save them without our aid. We are just the vehicles he uses.
Yeah. So there's a sense in which God is sovereign, and he will work his purposes out. But you're saying If he has a sense that God is moving him that direction, he should do it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I think I mostly agree with Matt, and also like to add that just the idea that God doesn't need us at all. He doesn't. He can do basically whatever he wants. If he wants to go and appear as a cloud and speak thunder into some village off in Africa and convert them that way, he can. But I know that he also prefers to use us that way, and he prefers to get us to go and do those things. Because the way I kind of see it, it's kind of like, you know, you're teaching maybe a little kid how to cook, right? And you're putting your hands on theirs and you're stirring the spoon with them and stuff. That's what I feel like it is. It's not that God needs us, like our parents don't need us to cook the chili for them or
Mm,
whatever's going on.
mm.
They don't need us, but they want us to learn and they want to teach us. They want us to do it. That's what I feel like it is. And it's also kind of funny to imagine it that way too.
Yeah, that's good. That's a great illustration, man. That's worth remembering. Yeah, God doesn't need us to cook, but he wants to teach us and be a part of that whole plan. Paul calls us co-workers with God. Um, Paul said, I worked harder than any of you. Okay. And it's also true that God met him on the road to Damascus and called him to that. So in your own lives, when God is, do you ever feel sometimes that God is calling you to things that you ought to do that this is the Lord, and that you actually have a choice, but kind of like, yeah, it's the Lord. You feel that way sometimes? Yeah, Grace, you nodded your head. What are your thoughts on that? Do you
My
feel,
thoughts
do you feel,
on,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just clarifying my thoughts on if I've ever felt that.
You ever feel those times that like God is moving, he's directing you to do things? Kind of hear it?
Um, yeah, I think I definitely have in my life. Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think you have a choice?
Yeah, I think I like have had choices of like if God's calling me to do something and let's say like I don't want to do it,
Yeah.
usually I think before I've kind of just had to like give that to him, and then slowly my desires will change and it'll line up with what he's asking me to do.
Yeah. It is a mystery, all this. And people get into these long debates about is God sovereign, or is there free choice? And I think one of you answered that question by saying both are true. And that's a mystery. They're both true. We do have free choice, and yet God is sovereign. How does that work out? Well, when we discover out whether light's a particle or a wave and why, maybe we'll have the answer. I mean, there's so much in physics that we don't understand. Yeah, go ahead, Tim. You'll have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Maybe it's also when we'll figure out why we're actually sitting on the Earth and not floating in space. But
Yes.
I think that's exactly it. It's sort of it's both, because the only reason we have free will is because God allows us to have free will.
Yeah.
And I think God is also, well, he's God. He's all powerful. I don't think I need to go into the explanation of how powerful he is, but if he wants us to do something, he knows every single thing about us, and he can actually go in and change our hearts. So it is our free choice, but if he's going in and he's manipulating the earth to put even something as silly as putting that particular song on a radio that gets you to think, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, or makes you feel like, oh, I understand now, or any number of things. He can manipulate anything on earth to move you in the direction he wants you to move. So whether we have free will or not, we usually do his will anyway.
Well, sometimes, yeah, but it's lovely to have the ability to say yes to him. And I certainly don't have this down pat, but this week we have a lot of people in our congregation, but I suddenly thought, oh, I should call such and such a man. And so I called him. He was delighted to talk to me about a half hour. Next day, he had a stroke. He's in the hospital. And I'm thinking, how did that happen? That I called him this week. It was my idea, and yet maybe it was God's prompting. And we don't want to get paranoid and worry that, oh, I should have done this or shouldn't have done that. I heard this and I didn't do it. You don't want to get neurotic about it, but God is speaking to us a lot of times. And I think this guy who stood up, young man, sit down when God pleases to birth you, he might be saying that's theologically correct, but he's also giving himself a lot of justification for his own lethargy too, isn't he? His own laziness. So practice listening to God. Anyway, thank you for your thoughts on that. We're not the end of it. So Carey in 1792 published a groundbreaking missionary manifesto. This guy wouldn't sit still. And it was called An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. And this became really important in England, this booklet. And he preached one Sunday on Isaiah 54, 2-3, and ended with these lines that are now famous throughout the Christian world. Expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. Wow. I don't know how great the things are I've attempted, but I've tried to obey him, and I've done unusual things. But Carey certainly did amazing things. And in 1793, after forming the Baptist Missionary Society, he, together with his reluctant wife, his poor wife, and this is really one of the puzzles about all of this, who had never been more than a few miles from home, boarded a Danish ship bound for India together with a medical missionary named Dr. John Thomas, and they landed in Calcutta in November after a 5-month trip. Now, Calcutta is in northeast India, on the east, pretty close to what's now Myanmar, and Bangladesh, and they landed in Calcutta after a 5-month trip, and they lived in terrible poverty. To stay alive and support his growing family, he got a job managing an indigo plant owned by British merchants. Britain had been in India for some time already. And some other missionaries joined him, some of whom began to look after his 4 sons because his wife had had a mental breakdown from which she never recovered. And I trust that today she's with God and completely recovered. I know she is. Carey said about learning all these languages he learned. He said about learning the Bengali language in Northeast India, which he published in a New Testament 6 years later. In 1801, this book was published, and it laid the foundations for the study of modern Bengali, which up to that time had been an unsettled dialect. Bengali is a major language in India, written language today in India, and it was because of John Carey. Otherwise, it was just a dialect. He and his colleagues moved to a city called Serampore, which was a Dutch colony because the British East India Company opposed their efforts to convert Hindus. You know, you think a lot of times of some people are criticized the gunboat and the merchant and the missionary. Well, a lot of times British policy was to oppose missionaries. They didn't want missionaries going in there for some reason. After 7 years of labor, he had his first convert, someone named Krishna Paul, who went to preach for 20 years with considerable effect. And they founded a college and opened a print shop. And over the next 28 years, Carey and his native helpers translated the entire Bible into all of India's major languages. Can you imagine that? Bengali, Oriya, Marathi, Hindi, Assamese, Sanskrit, and parts of 209 other languages and dialects. Unbelievable in 28 years. Many of these languages had never been printed before, but Carey only ever thought of himself as a plotter. You think of yourself as slow, well, you're in good company here. He suffered immense personal losses with the death of 2 spouses, several children, and many missionary friends and colleagues. At one time, his print shop burned down, along with much important translation work. But he just got up and kept going. By the time he died in 1834, he had spent some 41 years in India without a furlough. His mission could count only some 700 converts in a nation of millions, but he laid an impressive foundation of Bible translation, education, and social reform, including widely publicized public repudiation of the caste system. He fought it, as well as work that contributed to the abolition of infanticide, widow burning. Sati, that's when widows would, if their husband died, then they would jump onto the burning fire to be with their husband. He fought against it and helped to abolish it through his work with the British. And he fought against assisted suicide. So here he was doing all this and still translating all those languages. And today we'll find about that. I think maybe next Thursday we'll see, or one of these days, we're going to talk about how the church is growing in India today. Absolutely incredible. So here's this question for you. His first wife went crazy through a mental breakdown. Another died. Some of his children, after 41 years, he'd only see 700 converts. Was it worth it? Should we do that at the expense of a spouse? How do you interpret that kind of self-sacrifice and family sacrifice for the sake of the gospel? Would you do that today? Is that kind of thing God calls us to? What do we say? What do you think? It's a harder question, isn't it? I'm looking at the back of the room, you two. What do you think? Any ideas on that? How do we interpret that kind of suffering that goes on in a family's life when someone gives themselves so totally to Christ's work? Where do we draw the line between what God calls us to and what is some kind of imperious kind of inner sense of duty that makes us neglect family? Any advice there? Any thoughts about that? What do you think?
So on that specifically, part of your duty, and I think a lot in terms of duty and sacrifice and those kinds of things, that's the kind of person I am, but part of your duty is to your family. That's like having a family isn't some selfish thing. That's a part of what God called you to do, and you're responsible for those people. Your wife, your children, they're important. In fact, you're the only person, well, okay, that's gonna sound weird to say like their husband is the only person that can, take care of them, but as part of that family unit, whether you're a child or you're the mom or you're the dad or whatever is going on there, you're responsible for that family. You're a part of that family, and only that family can affect that family, right? So it's a part of your duty to be there for your family. And if you're going off and doing these things and self-sacrificing, well, that's hurting your family. It's hurting someone that you're responsible for. That's a part of your godly duty to take care of people.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm a therapist and I'm so busy trying to help other people that I let my family fall apart, well, I just hurt, however many people were in that family. I just hurt my 3 children and my wife. That's not doing my duty.
Okay, Tim, thank you. Any other thoughts? What do you think? I want to hear from you. I'm having trouble seeing you all. What are your thoughts on that, Isaac? Come out there. Come up. What do you think? We're not going to be able to hear you way back in the back. Elizabeth, is that you laughing back there? You're next.
What was the question? I couldn't hear you. I was so confused.
What happens? We've seen the life of John Kerry, and 2 of his wives died. His first one crazy when he left. And yet he laid the groundwork for an incredible growth in Christianity in India today. Some of his children died. Where do you draw the line as a Christian between duty to God and duty to your family? How do you make decisions? Are there any guiding principles that can help us?
Yeah. So I think one of the guiding principles that we can use is the Book of Job, right? Because in the Book of Job you have this man who's really prosperous and has everything he could possibly ask for, and then out of nowhere he gets everything taken from him. And then the Word of God says that even in those moments after all that happened, he still worshiped the Lord. I think in maybe there's some things where there's no definite answer for some things, but I do know that any guidance that we can possibly need can be found in the Word of God. But between drawing lines between duty to family and God, it's a hard one.
Yeah, it is hard. It is hard. It's hard. I'm not saying that there are easy answers here, Isaac. I guess I wonder about it today from our perspective in 21st century America. We have a different perspective than they did back in the 19th century, some of these people. But each of us needs to ask this question of himself or herself as we serve Christ. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on this?
So The Bible is pretty clear when it tells a husband that he has to love his wife as Christ loves the church. So I think that to start off, a man's priority should be his wife and his children, but his devotion should be for God. And through deep confirmation, both inside of church and elders and pastors, if God calls that man to go and spread the gospel and like really what is the word, in countries where they will probably be not very welcoming, then they should go in obedience to God, not just, oh, I think I should do this. Like, you really need to make sure that it's something that God is calling you to do, so that then you know that whatever happens is because it's his will. And if something bad happens, you won't have the guilt of thinking it's because I chose to do this that I lost my family, but that you will know, oh, okay, God called me, so there is a purpose, a higher purpose behind all of this. So I think it's absolutely important to put God above everything, so that whenever we make a decision, we know that it's from him, and that whatever comes from that decision, we have the certainty and the peace of knowing that it's under his sovereignty.
But very good answer. I wonder in terms of family too, if a person has a strong call that God is going to be using them in missions, or they're going to be called into a difficult place, they need to start saying, if you're single, God, help give me a partner who will share the same vision.
Yes, absolutely.
And not marry first and then try to associate them to your vision.
Mm-hmm.
And say, okay, God's called me to this, you got to come too. You want to partner with someone who shares your mission and love. And they're saying, yes, I'm with you heart and soul on this. Let's do it together. So I think it might be something. So incidentally, there is a book I'd like you to look at here. Oh, no, you don't have to look at it, but this man, Vishal Mangalwadi, has written a book called The Book That Made Your World. It's a fascinating book. He was raised in India, educated there. And he shows how in 20 key areas, from science to novels to social reform, everything good about India today, as well as the whole world, Western world, is traceable to the Bible. So if you're interested in reading the book that's not difficult reading, there's one to look at. It's just come out a few years ago. One of the greatest missionaries of all time was a man born in Yorkshire, England in 1832. And his name was Hudson Taylor. He was a missionary to China. Taylor spent 51 years in China, although he died in Switzerland. The society that he began was responsible for bringing over 800 missionaries to China, including Charles Studd, who was also a very famous missionary. He established 125 schools and brought 18,000 Chinese people to Christ. Taylor formed something called the China Inland Missionary, as opposed to where most missionaries were going at the time. They were settling along the coast. He had a vision for people inland, and so he formed the China Inland Mission, establishing 300 stations in some 18 provinces. What can we say about Taylor? Taylor was the son of a Methodist lay preacher and chemist, and professed faith in Christ at age 17, committing himself to going to China as a missionary. With his goal in mind, he began studying Mandarin, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. They all seem to be polyglots, these guys. He very early learned to live by faith, and on one occasion gave his last coin to a widow. He was just dirt poor. He gave his last coin to a widow with hungry children, remembering a verse in Proverbs, he who giveth to the poor lendeth to the Lord. That's from the Proverbs. The next day he found food on his doorstep. The next day he rose to find a package with a gold coin at his door. It was a lesson he never forgot and propelled him to make faith for God's provisions one of the outstanding pillars of his mission, what we call a faith mission today. Faith missions. Those are people who trust in God to provide. And he taught missionaries who joined his endeavor. Here are some of his famous quotes. He said, God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. That was Hudson Taylor. He also taught missionaries to adopt a native Chinese dress. He said, let us, in everything not sinful, become like the Chinese, that by all means we may save some. I know this was infuriated these traditional missionaries that were coming from Great Britain and America who lived on the coast in their embassies and in their little missionary compounds. He went to live among them. He shaved his forehead, dyed his hair black, adopted round spectacles, and wove in some black hair with his own to make a pigtail. This was fiercely opposed by other missionary societies and residents on the coast. Other principles that he adopted were that his missionary agency would accept candidates from any denomination, as long as the faith was evangelical. This would be called a non-denominational mission. He also felt that missionaries should not solicit funds, but should lay out all their needs before the Lord in prayer and faith. His motto was, through prayer, to move men to God. Not to ask for money, just to pray for it. What do you think of that? I'm coming to some of you who haven't answered yet, so watch out. Think about it. What do you think about that? Through prayer to move men by God. So he wouldn't solicit money. He just said, we're just going to pray about it until God brings in the money. And of course, people knew that they were intending to become missionaries. These people were intending to become missionaries, so they knew that there was going to be a need for funds. But through prayer to move men by God. What do you think, Mariana, of that?
I think that if being on a mission is something that God called him to do, I think he was on the right track. Through prayer, the funds would come, because I've seen it also on some of my friends who are missionaries. They do pray about it, but they also do their part too. They work and they save up to be able to do that calling that God is calling him to do. But I think he was on the right track, thinking that he should pray about it for funds.
Thank you. On the right track, he should pray about it, but he wouldn't hesitate to let people know if you had needs, if you were a missionary, and say, here are some needs, and you can contribute to those. Yeah, we can talk to. Today, that certainly is the attitude we have. What do you think, Daniel, back there in the back? I know you're there. What do you think? Is that good? Through prayer to move men by God. In other words, not to ask for money or to seek those funds or solicit them, but say, God, if this is your work, you provide the funds.
Yeah, it's definitely like just starting praying about it first off, just giving it to God and saying that just allowing him, if it's his will, then it will happen, and just perceiving that and knowing that. It's a lot of people just kind of, they want the money or whatever it is, they want what they want and their desire, but they don't. It's so important to start by asking God, like, if this is your will, that your let your will be done. Like, if it's what he wants, he will let it happen, and it's just accepting that, and not yeah, just knowing that, believing that. um
It's a hard one today because we're so used to hearing appeals for funds and things. I think you really need to be convinced about this in your own heart when you start it. So I can understand your hesitation, because what Hudson Taylor did through this faith mission was absolutely extraordinary, and God did move people hugely to contribute. That's not the pattern we have today. So I understand the dilemma, and I don't necessarily know what the answer is to that either. But I do know a lot of people are offended in non-Christian environments by how much emphasis sometimes the church puts on money today. And beware of these TV evangelists. Beware of them, please. Some of them have $100 million. Kenneth Copeland, oh my goodness. They say that they're in this for Jesus, but that's particularly his health and wealth, prosperity gospel. People just give to me, give to me, give to me. And God's going to bless you. Beware of making money into an idol. And that's what a lot of these television evangelists are doing. So thanks, Daniel. I appreciate your comments. Another thing about Taylor is that he included single women as missionaries and encouraged them, as well as the men, to don native dress. He says, look, these women are equal to us in every way. They need to be out there doing this work too. And they wore native dress. Other missionaries from other missionary societies often lived in sumptuous surroundings on the coast of China, and they were scandalized about what he was doing. But when Taylor died in 1905, the mission he founded, the China Inland Mission, was the largest Protestant mission in the world. He was buried next to his first wife, Maria, who had died of cholera near the Yangtze River. And was his work successful? We'll get to that later, but I'm told that at the time of the coming of communism in 1949, there were only some 600,000 to 1 million Protestant Christians in the whole of China. That's a lot. But if you knew how many there were today, you would be absolutely astounded. What would become of the church when communism came? Just another point on this thing about single women. We have a woman in our church who's single and was a missionary through Wycliffe to China for a number of years. And she's writing a thesis on something that in some ways she feels is something the church has not warned women about, and men, particularly women. And that is, they need to be well aware that they might go into the mission field single, and that they well might come out single too. They may not find a man to marry. That's a sacrifice that is not easy to make. And this woman she's very sweet, but you can see that there's a deep unhappiness there too for her. She was never warned that this might be the case. So once again, be aware of the sacrifices that God might call us to in this particular area of mission work. God isn't necessarily just going to provide you someone because you've made that step. I'd like to spend some time now and work on one last person whose name is David Livingstone. Oh, here is another slide, the China Inland Mission, and those yellow and pink and orange are different branches of the China Inland Missions, the stations that they were in China. Think of going into a land like that, so far off from your own culture, learning the language and donning native dress. You can see the pictures of the missionaries there on your left. 19th century. Man I like to talk about now is David Livingstone. He's Scottish. He was the forerunner of the missionary effort in Africa. Livingstone was a Scottish physician and among the greatest explorers of his day. Before he came on the scene, Africa's interior was almost entirely unknown to the outside world. His work of exploring and mapping Africa, including a search for the headwaters of the Nile, ignited Europe's imagination and opened up the continent to missionary as well as colonial work, actually. Livingstone experienced a religious conversion at the age of 20 and then went on to study medicine and theology in Glasgow, Scotland, with the intent of going to China. So some of these people, it was rather late in life, 20 years old, that he converted. And he decided he wanted to study medicine so he could bring his knowledge to China. He wanted to go to China, but he was rejected, or almost rejected, by the London Missionary Society because of his shyness and slowness of speech. Remember, Carrie talked about being a plotter? Livingstone's another. He was shy, slow of speech. And then the Opium War broke out in China, in which the British was enforcing opium trade upon China, and China revolted. It's a terrible, terrible chapter in British history. And because of that war, he applied to work instead with Robert Moffat in South Africa and arrived there in Cape Town in 1841. He married Robert Moffat's daughter, Mary, and began evangelizing in what's now Botswana, 900 miles north of Cape Town. He converted an energetic African chief who in turn began preaching to his own people. Wow, then the bones in one arm were permanently crushed by a lion, leaving him maimed and in pain to the end of his days. At that point, he abandoned farming and began a career as an explorer, crisscrossing the continent and mapping as he went. He discovered and named Victoria Falls in honor of the Queen of England, and became burdened by the millions in the interior who had never heard the gospel. He wrote to a friend, "Who shall penetrate through Africa?" But more than this, he developed a lifelong hatred of the Arab slave trade, which he discovered everywhere he went, and devoted his life to abolishing it. In 1857, he published his first book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa. And immediately he became famous. His one thought in writing it was, and I quote, "Poor enslaved Africa, when are thy bleeding wounds to be healed?" End of quote. Livingstone's book opened the eyes of the world to the horrors of the East African slave trade, but it also revealed the tremendous potentialities of Africa for human development, trade, and Christian missions. And through it all, he endured suffering that would have caused most of us to abandon our call long before. Livingston's wife died of fever after joining him on an expedition in Malawi in 1862. When he wrote of his wife's death, he said, "This heavy stroke quite takes the heart out of me. I married her for love. The longer I lived with her, I loved her the more. I tried to bend the blow as from our Heavenly Father. I shall do my duty still, but it was with a darkened horizon that I set about it." Incidentally, Hudson Taylor also had a huge, tremendous love for his two wives. There are books on it. I have one that's called Hudson Taylor and Maria, the love letters he wrote her. Livingston was tremendously burdened by the evil of the slave trade. He wrote at one point, "I sometimes fear that my statements, which are within the truth, may be looked on as exaggerations. But the facts cannot be overstated. We saw 3 instances of bodies tied to trees, the hands fastened behind to the tree, and a strong thong around the neck to the same tree keeps the body in a sitting posture even after death. This is the way in which these vile half-caste Arabs vent their spleen when a slave is no longer able to walk, vexed at losing their money. They secure their death. They glut the market with calico and gunpowder and send one tribe to plunder and destroy another." One of his expeditions across the Ruvuma River in what's now Tanzania, we're talking about South Africa and East Africa, that whole area, nearly failed because of the continual fouling of the paddle wheels from the bodies thrown in the river by slave traders. It was at this point that he uttered his most famous line, "I am prepared to go anywhere, provided it is forward." And on one occasion, he escaped death from slave traders 3 times in a single day. I am not a gun advocate, my friends, but he would leave guns with some of these tribes, and so they defend themselves against these Arab slave traders. There is a seminary, one of the missionaries from our church has gone out, and he teaches at a university called Livingstonia in Malawi. This man was greatly beloved. Everyone loved him. He kept giving his clothes and his clothes off to these people. It says that despite theft, disease, and lacerated feet, he managed to read through the Bible many times a year. He wrote, I would forget all my cold, hunger, suffering, and toils if I could be the means of putting a stop to this cursed traffic. And on May 1st, 1873, his servants found him in his tent, kneeling in prayer at his bedside. He was dead. He was 60 years old. His servants buried his heart in Africa, but carried his body back to England, where it was positively identified because of the crushed bones in his arm from the lion. His body was buried in great pomp in London's Westminster Abbey. So what was his influence, and why are we speaking of him today? Because he regarded himself as a missionary to the end, and as such inspired a whole new generation of missionaries to Africa. Many of his readers began work in Eastern and Southern Africa, his principal stomping ground, but hundreds went to West Africa and there died of malaria, many a few months after arrival. West Africa became known as the white man's grave. Hundreds of American missionaries and Black American missionaries, incidentally, died of malaria there. Because of him, and such greats as Wilberforce, England first forbade the African slave trade and then forbade slavery in her own territories, fighting against the slave trade itself in Africa with her navy. 30 years after his death, around 1900, it is estimated there were about 1 million African Christians. 30 years after his death, 1 million African Christians. Today, there are 631 million African Christians. For lack of time, and if you're interested, I'd love to have you study the life of this man. Anyone who wants to do it, make a report about him. William Cameron Townsend, 1896 to 1982, the founder of the Summer Institute of Linguistics, more commonly known as Wycliffe Bible Translators. His focus was on the translation of the Bible into the languages of unreached peoples and tribes, tribal groups. He had an incalculable influence in the spread of Christianity in the world. His thought was that Christ said that all the gospel must be preached among every tribe and people, and then the end will come. And so his purpose was to translate the Bible into any language which didn't have it. And I believe right now there are 600 total translations of the Bible in the world. And there are many, many, many more that are simply portions of translations. And much of this is because of William Cameron Townsend, the work he did. He began his work among indigenous people in Mexico. At the time he was working there among them, the government was secular and was against the Catholic Church. There had been a revolution, and there was a strong attempt to put down the Catholic Church. And but his work in linguistics and teaching indigenous people how to read was so respected that he won the right for his people to come work in Mexico among indigenous peoples. And actually, he used the term Summer Institute of Linguistics. This was a sneaky way to get his missionaries in, translating by calling it a kind of, making it look like a purely secular thing, teach people linguistics and how to write and how to read their own language and to translate their languages. So he had a huge impact today. Wycliffe. So that comes the end of my presentation. And I'm just wondering, what are your major takeaways from class today? You look at these, what happened here. What are you going to remember? What do you take away from all this discussion of Second Great Awakening, missionary movement, these great men? What do you think?
I'll share.
Just a minute. I don't see where you are. Who is this, Elizabeth? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I know that there's like a lot of great people within church history, but I was surprised that I'd never heard of William Carey and everything that he did. I honestly am interested in knowing more about him and his life. And again, surprised that I had never heard of what he did in his lifetime.
Which one? Who was it?
William Carey.
William Carey. Okay. The plotter learned so many languages. I don't understand how he could have done it. A guy who was just grown up the son of he was apprenticed as a shoemaker, but he was the son of something else. I can't remember. But wow, what an influence. Yeah, I hope you can read more.
Absolutely. That was mind-blowing too. It was absolutely mind-blowing to see everything that he did. I mean, I speak 2 languages and just trying to learn a third it's crazy because sometimes what you know of one language kind of crosses over with the other one. You start comparing it. It's really difficult. And to see everything that he did with his knowledge and just spreading the ability for other people to hear the gospel and read it in their own language, I think that's really admirable.
Huge. Thank you. Yeah. Who else? What's a takeaway from this? Matthew.
What I kind of took away is a lot of them said they were plotters. There was one who was slow of speech. And we've seen this in the Bible as well, but anyone who God wishes to use, he can use if they submit themselves to them. And also, you didn't really talk about Charles Studd, C.T. Studd, but later in his life, he went into the interior of Africa, if I'm remembering correctly, and old and diseases riddling his body, other diseases riddling his body, and God protected him while he was in Africa.
Wow.
I think it was over 20 years.
Wow. So he was first in China and then went to Africa. I did not know that. Wow.
If I'm remembering correctly, this is right, because he was back in England. They said he was gonna die soon because he had so many diseases from China, and said the Lord wants me to go to Africa, so he went to Africa, and didn't die, but instead God preserved him for years.
Amazing. I have to look that man up, C.T. Studd, and see. I knew the name, but I did not know his life. Thank you, man. Appreciate that. And I love what you said about God can use anybody, even plotters. People who are slow and shy. God can use us all. That doesn't mean he's going to use us all in huge, tremendous, great ways, but he can use us all. Yeah.
As someone who is also definitely a bit of a plotter, that's very comforting.
Yeah.
And I also, one of the things that I sort of noticed among a lot of other things that I've learned is just that like Livingston, I didn't even know that he was a missionary. I knew that he explored Africa, but I didn't know he'd had anything to do with Christianity. It almost seems like the secular world takes a lot of Christian things and tends to just pick out the little bits of Christianity and throw them away and say, like, yeah, this person did this, and they just forget all about why or how. And to be honest, quite frankly, it makes me angry. It's frustrating.
A lot of what we do is quiet and unknown in the world today, but the same is true of many of our institutions, higher learning. They have a Christian origin, but we try to strip away what's Christian and hope that the edifice will still stand. But a lot of times it's been gutted. Nothing's left. But a lot of the good things happen in our country and our culture in the West and the world happen because of the Christian faith. No. It's lovely. Who was it that David Livingston met? Remember who that was? Livingston met when so-and-so met Livingston. I can't remember now. For some reason the name just escapes me, but he was a man who was sent out by a geographical society in England to try to find Livingston. Found him. And he said, Livingston, I presume. That's a famous line. You can look that up. Any other takeaways? Anybody like to share? Going, gone. Okay. Thank you for coming today. We will see you Thursday. Bless you. You have a good day.
Thank you. Have a good day, sir.
Thank you, man. Looking forward to your paper, man.
I'll get to you soon.
Okay.